morning. Good morning. How's everyone doing? Good, good. Welcome to the second panel of this conference today, Theorizing the American Experience. My name is Jessie Taylor, and I'm a senior here at Brooklyn College. And I'm going to introduce the first speaker today, Jordan Joachim, who is presenting today on Disanalogizing Domination, Tyranny and the Political Thought of Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells. And he is a PhD candidate in the Department of Government at Cornell, where he specializes in political theory. He is interested in American political thought, classical Greek political thought, democratic theory, and accounts of tyranny and the history of political thought. His dissertation research examines the use made of discourse of tyranny in 19th and early 20th century African-American political thought, with a view towards developing an account of racial tyranny as a constitutive part of the American regime. So without further ado, welcome, Jordan.
So in this project, in this paper, I examined Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells' deployment of the language of tyranny and their respective engagements with slavery in the antebellum period and the lynch mob following Reconstruction. In doing so, I considered the significance of their engagements for the study of tyranny as a concept in the history of political thought, and with a view more centrally towards tracing forms of continuity and forms of racial domination in the context of American political thought and practice. More broadly, I argue, their accounts, when read together, challenge the sufficiency of more familiar ways of theorizing tyrannical domination that focus specifically on arbitrary rule. For the context of America specifically, I argue Douglass and Wells to trace a continual anxiety regarding the perceived precarity of white dominion, and it's a tendency for this racialized fear to motivate extra-legal forms of surplus violence by white citizens across their respective historical contexts. So as a political concept, tyranny has long been associated with the attainment of or desire for rule on an arbitrary basis. Likewise, life under the arbitrary will of another, under a tyrant, has been cast from Aristotle to Locke as a form of figurative enslavement. And so far as one is vulnerable to the tyrant's caprice, one is dominated as if a slave. In contemporary political theory, those influenced by a neo-Roman Republican tradition of political thought have sought to uncover an account of freedom defined by the absence of such capacities for mastery. According to this view, domination entails the institutional capacities necessary to rule according to will and appetite. That is, a political context which enables the exercise of power over others without normative or constitutional constraint. To be free is to live in the absence of the very threat of tyrannical rule, and hence of such slave-like treatment. As Philip Pettit puts it, it's one of the more prominent figures in this tradition, quote, "The condition of liberty is explicated by the status of someone who, unlike the slave, is not subject to the arbitrary power of another," end quote. So the scholar Mary Nyquist argues in her work on traditions of anti-tyrannicism, the neo-Roman Republican tradition takes this master-slave analogy as central. She argues that this discursive logic depends upon, without sufficiently interrogating, actual practices of enslavement. At its worst, this way of framing the abuses of tyranny mobilizes the master-slave analogy in a way that structurally depends on the existence of those for whom, from the perspective of the anti-tyrannicist, such rule would not be inappropriate. That is, the charge of tyranny then risks reinscribing a hierarchical logic that simultaneously depends upon while minimizing actual practice, only acknowledging them for the sake of polemical force. Relatedly, the political theorist Neil Roberts argues in his book, Freedom is Marinage. According to his view, the neo-Roman account of freedom is complicit in a form of moral and political disavowal, insofar as it registers the cruelty of slavery through the figure of the dominated, while immediately thereafter robbing it from sustained scrutiny. Additionally, this figurative deployment of slavery robs actual historical slaves of agency, positioning them only as passive sufferers or the exclusively analogic other to the condition of freedom, and thus neglecting their own actual efforts at resistance and flight. Most crucially, Roberts shows how former slaves, such as Douglass in the United States, more centrally for his account, actors within the Haitian Revolution, formulated powerful accounts of freedom in their own right that exceed the terms of neo-Roman republicanism. In joining these points of critique, I argue the neo-Roman view's hegemonic status to obscure other ways in which tyranny might be understood and theorized. As I try to show in my paper, a lack of engagement with those writing about slavery and its afterlives in historical context impoverishes our understanding of tyrannical power to the extent that we neglect those that read slavery particularly and not analogically as a mode of tyrannical domination. So to begin with Douglas, he invites us, I argue, to consider tyrannical domination in a way that stresses less the unbridled and unaccountable deployment of arbitrary power, though this is part of the picture, and more the strategically repressive logics that underwrite it. Crucial to Douglas' reworking of tyranny, I think, is its ability to flag and identify what we might take to be an undercurrent of fear or insecurity on the part of what he calls slave power, one that extends through the conduct of individual slave owners and overseers, legal measures like the Fugitive Slave Act, and other efforts to extend and defend the institution of slavery. As Douglas writes in the poem The Tyrant's Jubilee, quote, "The pathway of tyrants lies over volcanoes. The very air they breathe is heavy with sorrows. Agonizing heartthrobs convulse while they are sleeping, and the wind whispers death as over them sweeping." End quote. For Douglas, the restless sleep of the tyrant, or what Alexis de Tocqueville once called the nightmare constantly haunting the American imagination, the threat of slave rebellion or insurrection, is a central part of understanding the distinctively tyrannical nature of many of slavery's devices of social and political domination. So in reconstructing an account of tyranny from Douglas' writings and speeches, what emerges most clearly is an understanding of tyrannical power that has, at its core, a certain appreciation for its own indefensibility or lack of legitimacy. Specifically, Douglas positions the tyrannical work of slave power as turning on its own acknowledged and then disavowed intolerability to the enslaved, one that constantly courts the risk of resistance and concomitantly mandates modes of counter-subversion. So Douglas frequently highlights slavery as a system of distinctively lawless violence. Even while secured through the US Constitution, enshrined in standing law, Douglas insists on the language of illegality in his critique. I read him as doing so by virtue of chattel slavery's basic and irreducible expression as force, and the way that this force ultimately undermines any claim to political legitimacy for the institutions that protect it. So as he proclaims in What to the Slave is the 4th of July, there is not a man beneath the canopy of heaven that does not know that slavery is wrong for him. And as he states similarly elsewhere, slavery is a system of brute force, but it shields itself behind right. So Douglas here refers to the immediacy of chattel slavery's violence, but also, and at the same time, he highlights its absolute incompatibility with any condition of political consent. Douglas exposes then the legal protections erected around chattel slavery as second-order expressions of force. As he puts it, the law is always an aftercoming consideration. Wicked men first overpower and subdue their fellow into slavery, and then call in the law to sanction the deed. So more than underwriting his own critique of slavery, Douglas shows this logic of force and the disavowed acknowledgement thereof to motivate counter-subversive practices across contexts of slave domination. Two in particular emerge in the context of Douglas' autobiographical writings. One being the denial of reading lessons from his Baltimore master, Hugh Auld, and the other being the murder of a fellow slave by the overseer Austin Gore, later in his life. In the case of Auld, he denies reading lessons to Douglas because he would be, as he puts it, ruined as a slave, prone to increased discontentment, and more inclined towards forms of disobedience if he were to continue to receive his education. In the context of Gore's murder of the disobedient slave on the plantation, Douglas notes that he was, quote, setting a dangerous example to the other slaves, one which, if suffered to pass without some demonstration on his part, would finally lead to the total subversion of rule and order on the plantation. End quote. In recounting the event, Douglas describes the act of murder as a means through which to publicly deny other slaves an example of unanswered resistance to plantation rule, and the fact that the murder of the slave itself goes unanswered by any kind of legal challenge is an important part of the story as well. In each case, Douglas positions an attempt at either intellectual stultification or plantation violence and murder as repressive practices that proceed through the assumption of the fundamental cruelty and illegitimacy of the system they police, and of the ongoing systematic demand to circumvent or suffocate potential sites of resistance or dissent that slavery invariably provokes. So, returning to what to the slave is 4th of July, Douglas describes so-called bloodhound gangs following the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, as he puts it, tools and bodyguards of the tyrants of Virginia and Carolina. Likewise, Douglas provides a view on a series of actors and acts distributed across the Southern slave economy and the efforts of bloodhound gangs of the North, which extend the violence of the white supremacist state to non-state actors. One of the hallmarks of tyranny in the history of political thought is a ruler's dependence on extra-legal modes of coercion. Douglas shows this to be the case in the antebellum South, where the extra-legal violence and coercion of American racial tyranny is distributed across divergent and overlapping registers of repression, all of which underpinned by a form of racialized fear. Turning then to Ida B. Wells, she too draws our attention to the extra-legal violence of American white supremacy in the years following Reconstruction and black male enfranchisement. She also signals the motive work of fear. Commenting on the emergence of the lynch mob, Wells writes, quote, "That same tyrant is at work under a new name and a new guise. The very same forces are at work now as then. Tyranny persisted, it had simply taken a different shape." So according to Wells, white citizens acting to murder and mutilate the bodies of recently enfranchised black men were defending what she names the principle of white rule, securing its standing against the rise of potential black political power, and mobilizing scenes of murder so as to intimidate the recently enfranchised. As Wells writes in Southern Horrors, quote, "From this exposition of the race issue in lynch law, the whole matter is explained by the well-known opposition growing out of slavery to the progress of the race. This is crystallized in the oft-repeated slogan, 'This is a white man's country and the white man must rule.'" Underwriting the murderous violence of lynch mobs was the principle of white rule for Wells. It stood, as she puts it, as the address of the South to its former slaves and new citizens. Quote, "To the Afro-American, the South says, the white man must and will rule. There is little difference between the antebellum South and the new South." End quote. For Wells, the differences that mattered served to explain the particular manifestations of racial tyranny post-Reconstruction. Under chattel slavery, restrictions on literacy were intended to stultify African-American intellectual capacities so as to ensure slave owners absolute control over black bodies. Tracing a shift in the axis of disempowerment during and after Reconstruction, Wells revises her view on the dynamics of racial tyranny. No longer capable of utterly eviscerating spaces of education, the lynch mob mobilized in order to ensure that African Americans understood the risks of violence they faced for acting politically, using charges of rape, as she puts it, as a plausible screen. That is to say, yet another claim to right behind which racial tyranny might shield itself. As the scholar Lori Balfour has recently argued, Wells sought, quote, "to expose the political culture that sustained this violence and interpret the savagery as an attack on African American men and women as citizens," end quote. So transitioning from anxieties over black insurrection to black rule, white citizens pursued practices of rule maintenance and control that Wells identified as continuous with the fear-based assault that took place under slavery. Commenting on the effects moments of insurrection initiated by actors like Nat Turner arguably visited upon America's immoral imagination in prior decades, the nation, Wells suggests, may have been at least momentarily persuaded to the view, as she puts it, that slavery was not a monster, but a tyrant. That is, as opposed to being merely a grotesque exception to the bases of political authority in America, citizens had come to terms, if partially, with the slave power's hegemonic status as a dominant logic of rule. According to Wells, the misplaced sense of innocence facilitated by the language of monstrosity reemerged in the years following Reconstruction. Engaging in different practices and adopting a new face, this time that of lynch law, white citizens sought to resecure their position as an authoritative element in the American regime, ready once again, on Wells' view, to disavow the terroristic or tyrannical violence with which they were complicit. So, to close, reading Douglas and Wells' mobilizations of tyranny, I think assists in bringing to view the persistent and conjoined threads of racialized fear, violence, and political authority in America. And I think it comes at a time where the attraction as a language of tyranny is especially felt in relation to the current administration, but where in that case the tendency for disavowal is potentially heightened, and why we might want to return to those camps today.
Thank you, Jordan. So I'm going to save questions for the end of everybody's presentations. So next, I'm going to introduce Ian Shane Peebles, who's presenting a paper entitled Tearing the Veil on Du Boisian Double Consciousness from a Neo-Kingian Perspective of Self-Purification. And Peebles received his BA from Wheaton College and his MA from Viola University. His research primarily focuses on normative and applied ethics, particularly the Neo-Aristotelian tradition and its intersection with contemporary ethical issues. Contemporary ethical issues of interest include issues in biomedical ethics, issues regarding race relations and racial reconciliation in the United States, and issues regarding the criminal justice system in the United States. Other areas of interest include moral psychology, philosophy of race, and the philosophy of mind as it relates to aesthetic judgments. He, his wife, and their 2 boys currently reside in Riverside, California, so join me in welcoming Ian Shane Peebles.
Good morning. I hope you don't mind. My computer died and I didn't have a printer, so I'm going to have to read my notes off my phone. I promise I'm not texting. I'm just trying to just deal with me. The title of my paper is Tearing the Veil, the Psychological Debt of Du Boisian Double Consciousness and a Way Forward Through Neo-Kingian Self-Purification. That is very pedantic, but it will make sense in just a little time. So give me some time to kind of fill that out. Let's see. I need to use the mouse. All right. 120 years ago, Du Bois wrote The Strivings of the Negro People, in which he described the inner turmoil within the black psyche using the term double consciousness. I believe that now, in 2017, this is still a problem for the African American community, in large part because most of our fight has been with legislation and trying to legislate equality and racial reconciliation. So my goal is threefold. I first want to define what Du Boisian double consciousness is, here to refer to as DC. I want to highlight some contributing factors to DC. And then I want to look for a way forward using King's concept of self-purification. So, goal 1, defining DC. Before I can explain what DC is, it's important that you first understand what Du Bois understood as the veil. He first introduces it when talking about, or giving an anecdote about when he was in grade school and passing out greeting cards, and one of the white students denied his greeting card. And he wrote, "Then it dawned upon me with a certain suddenness that I was different from the others. Our light may have in heart and life and longing, but shut out from the world by a vast veil." For Du Bois, the veil was a metaphor for the physical, economic, political, judicial, and social segregation present in America. So palpable and demeaning was this veil that Du Bois actually writes in The Souls of Black Folk about his infant son's death, that it was better for him to have died only shadowed under the veil than being deformed and choked by it. With that in mind, we can now talk about DC. Now, this is a lengthy quote, but it's going to undergird much of what I have to say, so I'm going to read it for you guys. "The Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with the veil and gifted with the second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. He would not Africanize America, for America has too much to give the world in Africa. He would not bleach his Negro soul in the flood of white Americanism, for he knows that Negro blood has a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American, without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity he's referring to for self-development to be closed roughly in his face. DC, for Du Bois, and his audience would have understood this, was an allusion to a psychological element akin to dissociative identity disorder. And it caused a triple damage. I'm going to skip those other quotes just for the sake of time. First, it was the inability to attain identity through self-realization due to the suffocation or perhaps preoccupation with others' disparaging perceptions and mistreatment of the black community. Second, it was the inability to reconcile African roots with American sensibilities, which resulted in a two-ness, a fractured psyche. And third, it was an inability to effectively use their powers, they're referring to the black community, as they were often spread too thin between the world outside the veil and the world within. So, in one section of The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois actually describes black professionals who are trying to edify the black community while also contributing something of value to the white community. And in this process, spreading their powers too thin. Now, in keeping in line with the theme of our conference, The Cost of Freedom, I've actually been able to see DC as both a psychological debt and psychological imprisonment, and I want to kind of elaborate on those. As it regards to debt, I believe it can be seen as a psychological debt for three reasons. The first being that it's a disadvantaged starting point. So the black person dealing with DC is starting in a hole and trying to climb their way out of it. Also, I think that it makes it difficult to accrue value and assets. It eats away at your income, which in this case would be the energies of the black community. And finally, it's continually accruing interest, meaning that as we continue to let DC persist, it continues to compound. Now, in terms of imprisonment, the person is taken captive by the perception of others, as well as losing some of their autonomy and not being able to live fully free and fully realized. DC was an existential and social crisis. The African Americans attempt to unify two identities while navigating social structures infused with racism and segregation. More specifically, it was the attempt to cope with having one's status as an American degraded by sheer fact of being black. This is a contentious definition, and a lot of people, there isn't universal agreement on what is meant by Du Boisian double consciousness. However, I feel like this will work for us. In wading through all of the sources, there were three issues that I noticed. I'm not going to go into great detail with them because I want to give you guys time for questions. I will just briefly mention them. The first issue being the issue of universality. So there are some scholars who believe that DC is not a phenomenon that all black people experience. In response, I borrow from Sicario Mayor, in which he describes DC as a potentiality latent in every African American and more acute in those that believe they can penetrate the veil or that they can cross the segregation line. And so in that sense, DC has this degree property about it. The second thing would be redemptive value. There are some that have argued that both the veil and DC, though horrendous, have brought some sort of value. I acknowledge that, but I also say that it is a consolatory good, meaning that it is a consolation prize as opposed to the real prize, which is freedom and self-realization, self-consciousness. And finally, the third issue would be an issue in conflation. Some people have conflated the veil with DC. However, they don't share the same properties. So using Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals, you can just see that they're not the same thing. For example, DC is the greed, the veil is not. The veil is the materiality of segregation, where DC is not. There's also been a conflation in second sight. So this is one of those redemptive value things. They believe that it is the epistemically privileged position of African Americans, and that they can see the world as it truly is due to the injustices that they face. I would not reduce DC to second sight, though. If you look at Du Bois' writings, to do so would commit him to tautology, in which he would be trying to define DC using DC. Rather, it's better to see second sight as a constituent of DC. So, all right, moving on. Let's look at some of the contributing factors. There are 5 contributing factors that I want to highlight. These are both traditional factors as well as contemporary factors. The first one being social norms. So in my paper, I look at the way America perceives certain musical genres, as well as the way we value certain phenotypic traits over others. Second one would be media. This is not anything new to you guys. You're very aware of the way media has created Black culture and Black people. 2 examples would be The Birth of a Nation, the 1915 film. More recently, there was a show called Brickleberry, which pulled out all the stops for stereotypes. Third would be scientific racism. So the attempt to try to justify racism using pseudosciences like phrenology, certain eugenic movements of the 20th century, and unilineal evolution. Fourth would be institutional injustices. I look specifically at religious praxis. I look at the way the evangelical church in America specifically has colluded with certain oppressive philosophies and ideologies of their culture, the ways that they have sometimes overlooked some of the injustices facing the Black community. And the fifth contributing factor is actually within the bill, and it is certain self-imposed constraints that the Black community puts on itself in regards to cultural expression, so that if you don't act that way and you are Black, you are considered acting white or outside the realm of Black culture. Okay, moving forward, a solution. I look specifically at King's self-purification for 2 reasons. First, King was very familiar with the bill and with DC. If you read his literature, you'll see that these are not things that are foreign to him. But more importantly, I think that if you're going to look for a solution, it has to match the nature of the element that you're looking at. And again, I'm arguing that DC is a psychological element. That is, so I look for a solution that is closer to cognitive behavioral therapy and the cultivation of virtue, and I find that in King's self-purification. He first introduces or uses the word self-purification in Letter from a Birmingham Jail in 1963, but the idea is littered throughout his literature. It goes back to 1957, and it's even shown in a posthumous publication, Showdown for Nonviolence, in 1968. I'll read this quote for you about it. In any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps: collection of the facts to determine whether injustices exist, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. Mindful of the difficulties involved, we decided to undertake a process of self-purification. We began a series of workshops on nonviolence, and we repeatedly asked ourselves, are you able to accept blows without retaliating? Are you able to endure the ordeal of... I can't really see that. Can you guys? Oh my goodness. Of jail. There you go. All right. Current slide. All right. I'm going to go ahead and skip these other ones for the sake of time. I'm going to continue to, this is my working definition of self-purification. It's engaging in introspection through some activity or activities of habituation to cleanse oneself in preparation for nonviolent direct action to obtain justice, with an emphasis on forethought regarding future behaviors and actions, specifically how to manifest those desired nonviolent behaviors and dispositions in response to violent opposition. I think this is a good start, but I think that it helps to expand the definition and to also include a retrospective aspect in which the agent is looking back at their life and asking what in their life, what in their worldview, what in their thinking patterns actually perpetuates the injustice that they're trying to fight. And so that would lead to this revised definition. Engaging in introspection that includes both forethought regarding future behaviors and retrospection of one's current worldview and self-perception through some communal activity or activities of habituation to cleanse oneself in preparation for nonviolent action and to begin the process of self-transformation so as to be a more just agent in the building of the just society. There are 4 benefits to this. First, it allows the agent to identify those vicious habits she's not aware are vicious and may not even realize she is participating in. Second, it allows the agent to identify unwarranted beliefs and defective reasoning patterns and begin the process of cultivating practical intelligence, or what Aristotle refers to as phronesis. Third, it gives proper direction to and equips its participant with the proper means for direct action and refines their psychological or moral disposition so that they might more effectively identify and rectify injustices present in society. And finally, it indirectly acknowledges the insufficiency of legislation for racial reconciliation by identifying the origin of some injustices in one's intellectual and moral dispositions. I'll conclude with this quote. It's from King. He says, "Change in human psychology is normally a slow process, but it is safe to predict that when a people is ready for change as the Negro has shown himself ready today, the response is bound to be rapid and constructive. The freedom sought by African Americans is found in a concerted effort of renewing their perception of self, the perception of others, and the role their current disposition plays in their psychological imprisonment, with the conscientious awareness and honest reflection of those outside the Bill regarding their portrayal of blacks, the influence of their social structures and institutions, and the power and privilege they possess. These needed activities of the mind suggest there is a defect in both camps as it relates to intellectual virtue. And until these flaws are acknowledged and virtue cultivated, policy is insufficient in bringing about the freedom desired. And while I acknowledge that a change in cultural structure and legislation would also be helpful, I think it will be important to emphasize the change in an individual's worldview." Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. And our final presenter today is going to be Kalfani A. Lawson, who is presenting a paper entitled "Of 0 Point Freedom, the Cost of Othering." And Kalfani is currently a third-year Master of Divinity candidate at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University. And for the 2016 to 17 academic year, he is on exchange at the Theology Fakultät at Georg August Universität Göttingen University in Germany. And he's writing a thesis that examines notions of black exile and the experience of perpetual homelessness in one's own home. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Political Science, Global Affairs, with a minor in African and African Diaspora Studies from Kennesaw State University. So join me in welcoming Kalfani.
So, quick point of clarification. Can I use this mic here?
Let's use that.
All right. Okay. I'd like to sit down, but it's okay. Sorry for the craziness, folks. Alright, so, can everyone hear me? Alright, sorry, I suck at using microphones, so I apologize. So hello, I'm Kalfani, and one of the first things I want to point out is that I am absolutely terrible at naming things. I get wigged out about subject lines and email addresses, so the title, maybe we can work out a new one through the discussion of, of what the actual content is, but the terms, the term 0 point does come up throughout the discussion. So, but we do want to talk about the cost of othering. This is a conference about costs and debt, so to speak. So we want to talk about these points. So I want to take kind of a narrative approach also in talking about how this kind of came to the fore for me. It's something to really talk about and discuss. 0 point and cost of othering. What does this mean? And I kind of struggle with talking about conversion moments also. So I'll start with when I picked up Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me. Sorry, Indy. So as I'm reading through this book, this is in 2015. We know where the country is in this moment. We're in this conversation about Black lives mattering. Black life is matter. This physical, corporeal matter comes up as a constant theme throughout Coates' work. I ask of you, if you have a chance to return to it, or if you haven't read it, please read it. But I want you to pay attention to Coates' use of the term the body. The body, the black body, the broken black body. I want to pay attention to how the term repeats and where it finds itself. And something about the way and how many times Coates talked about the term body, it really struck with me, and something really stood out. It wasn't quite clicking for me what it was, so I wanted to look into and kind of theorize into this problem for me. What is it about Coates' use of the body? What is this unstated thing that's being said when Coates says the body? And so now that I've said it enough, I also want to say at the same time, I'm also taking a systematic theology course where systematic theology assumes that we have something to say about God if one believes there is a God, or if that's your cup of tea. And so the problem for me was trying to take theological language to Coates' repetition of the body in Between the World and Me, because there's so much baggage that comes with it. For example, one of the things I have to do often is pray at Thanksgiving because I'm in seminary. That's part of the baggage. So I want to think new, and I wanted to think into this problem of the body, the black body, so to speak, with theological language. And so what ends up happening when you look at Coates' use of the body is, in Between the World and Me, is there's this kind of remembrance, I call it, that remembers the black body, so to speak. So what Coates is doing, for example, when he talks about the spirit and the soul are the body and brain, which are destructible, which is precisely why they're so precious. And so this is just one example, but you see Coates takes the soul, the brain, and says these are the things, the body, and that can be broken, and it talks about value in these terms. And he also says that the spirit did not steal away on gospel wings. The soul was the body that fed the tobacco. Again, we have this kind of bringing the body together, remembering it. He said that it fed tobacco, and the spirit was the blood that watered the cotton, and these created the first fruits of the American garden. And if you do not know, Coates is atheist, but he's adopting this kind of theological language to talk about the American project, the American garden, what it costs. And so I wanted to go back through this to think about, okay, so we have the American garden here. We've got the black body, we've got theological language. There's a problem for me when it comes to the American project. I wanted to think what it meant to have a God at the center that's not really maybe a Christian God, so to speak. I wanted to talk about whiteness. That's the one thing I didn't think was articulated enough, because I think it is whiteness that renders the body, in Coates' discussion, materials for its construction. I don't know if that makes sense, but let's try and work through this. So you have, for Lewis Gordon, this idea of a Theodician construct, so to speak. So a Theodician construct, as he writes, or rather theodicy, is the form of a justificatory practice in which a god or deity's integrity is maintained through the articulating of externality of infelicities over which such a being is presumed to have control. And so if we think about whiteness on these terms, does whiteness do these things? Does whiteness require something made external to maintain its internal integrity? And this is the question that before. And then Theodician grammar, for Lewis Gordon, is a kind of grammar that fields systemic preservation, which means what is at the core requires what is made external to maintain its integrity. So it's not just a finite thing. You don't make something external. It continually problematizes the integrity of the core. And so the problem really for this kind of construction is that when you involve humans and talk about whiteness, you're talking about white subjects, the people who are pursuing whiteness, or perhaps worshiping it as a kind of Theodician construction. You have the problem of human presence, or the black body, for example, needs to function outside of the realm of human in order to become object to the construct's integrity. I'm sorry. Again, I don't know if that's all the way clear, but we're working through it. Another way to kind of talk about whiteness as a Theodician construct came up kind of randomly for me in another course where I was reading Toni Morrison's Playing in the Imagination, I believe it's called, or Blackness in the White Imagination. And Morrison talks about a kind of master narrative that plays a role in early American literature. The master narrative, or rather the problem, we'll say, is how could one speak of profit, economy, labor, progress, suffragism, Christianity, the frontier, the formation of new states, the acquisition of new lands, education, transportation, both freight and passengers, neighborhoods, the military, or anything else a country concerns itself with without having a referent at the heart of the discourse, at the heart of the definition, which was for Morrison the presence of Africans and their descendants. She writes that it's not possible. The Theodician construct cannot construct itself out of nowhere. And so what she says is the kind of mediating presence for the construct of whiteness in the American project is what she calls the American Africanist presence. And one of the primary functions of this is that mediation of what it means to be white. So, and so we're clear what I'm talking about is a whiteness, or rather whiteness as a Theodician construct that is defined by an external construct out of negation. What's not clear when you don't have the black externality, what does that mean for the internal integrity of the deity? And so you have the master narrative also, but then there comes other terms that came about for me, and this is the part where 0 point comes in. Santiago Castro Gomez talks about the 0 point and the oracle voice, which recognize that there has to be at the center of this 0 point an oracle voice position, or rather, what's allowed by these kinds of positions is the ability to speak about and describe and inscribe meaning on things that are external. If we talk about freedom, then I think from the points of the master narrative, for example, or in terms of Theodician grammar, or terms of 0 point or oracle voice that assume this kind of objective position that allowed them to not only just make external and create a presence, or rather we can call them objects. What's allowed is a kind of a reflection back into, or rather there's this kind of construct out of negation, so to speak, for me. And for me, that is, I wanted to think about this as whiteness. So for example, if we think about the term Black Lives Matter, and we think about the existential crises with which the concept is met with. No, it's not Black Lives Matter, it's all lives matter. Or even better, there's Blue Lives Matter, which what happens when your black parents are police officers, for example. Where does this come in? But I wanted to talk about that shift. That what is it? What are the mathematics? What is the construct that makes that kind of response, the response that helps mediate whatever tension there is when we talk about Black life mattering. And so I was thinking that perhaps it is whiteness as a construct of a deity that requires Blackness made external, functioning outside of the realm of normality, humanity, subjectivity, so to speak. And so there's far more, and actually that's partly glad why I'm here. There's far more scholars who've examined this kind of language. I sat in Sabine Brooks' living room in Bremen, and she was telling me, giving me homework and stuff to read, and I was like, oh dear God. So in closing, I have no solution here, but I do want to try and think about what is at stake if at the center of what is considered to be normative in the American project is whiteness. If we look at it as a Theodician construct, what does that mean for whiteness? And what does that mean for those who serve as objects of its construction? It's a very bleak picture. In that sense, I'm an atheist because in order to subscribe to this kind of faith tradition, it requires my non-humanity, so to speak. And so, I leave it at that, and thank you all so much.
Okay, let's thank all of our panelists again, please. And for questions, if you have any, what we're going to do is you're going to raise your hand, and I'll take a list of you as I see your hands go up. So do we have any questions from the audience? All right, so we'll start with you.
First question is for Ian. I was wondering whether it might be productive to connect what you've done with Judith Butler's psychological power to look more into like the conditions of this self-purification you're interested in. And I'm saying that, I'm a sociologist, and currently I'm working in a city that formerly carried the name of Karl Marx. What I'm interested in here is what are actually the conditions of possibility for this kind of introspection to become effective on a mass basis, on which I haven't heard so much yet. You've talked about like practices, communal practices of habituation, but what would be the conditions to make it kind of probable that these will be more than individual occurrences? Especially considering that in the end you said that legislation is insufficient. Wouldn't you also need to look into forms of legislation and also possibly other forms of material restructuring to make this kind of change possible and not ineffective as a purely, so to say, moral call? My other question would be, or Jordan, thanks so much for this.
We'll take one at a time.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
As it regards legislation is a necessary component, but it's not a sufficient component. Absolutely, you need to legislate equality of some sort. I'm glad that Jim Crow laws no longer are in effect, obviously. In terms of what conditions are needed for the possibility of self-purification, that's something that I'm still exploring. The papers are supposed to be 6,000 words. I'm already at like 9,300, so I have a lot of chopping to do. But what I hope to do is look a little bit more in depth at how King tried to exercise self-purification for his community. So one of the quotes that I skipped, he talks about how they would have weekly meetings in which the individuals would have to basically sit under training where they are being verbally abused and demeaned in order to see if they are able to actually maintain a non-retaliatory stance in the face of that. It was very important for him that they go through some initiation prior to being put out on the front lines. And I think a lot of that was done in trainings and meetings and various teachings that you would give in the local community. So if there's some way to try to frame the expanded self-purification that I've spoken about in a similar way, in which we're able to have some sort of gathering, I think that might be a start. The thing with self-purification is I don't think that it's something you can force on an individual. So in terms of like mass scale ensuring that everybody in the world is doing it, I don't know if you can really do that. But it's worth thinking a little bit more about. So I don't know if that answers your question.
And before your second question, does anybody else have any questions before we?
I want to follow up on both points. I think what comes to mind in relation to both your and California's question and your bringing in Butler is really chapter 10 of the Souls of Black Folk, and the role of religion within the lives of African Americans, and he takes it back to the Mid-Atlantic Passage and life on the plantation, and then the Christianization thereof, and the centrality, and of course, in much of that, in his construction of what Black leadership could look like, King fulfills that. But I think we can't lose sight of the continued role of the Black church in these processes.
Thank you so much for all of your papers. I had a question for Ian, but also kind of more generally on this question of religiosity, as well as his connection to ideas of the domestic. So I was struck as you were talking about evoking the veil, as well as also these metaphors of cleansing and purification, how these metaphors that can be seen as religious are also connected to interiority or the domestic, and kind of how you see that playing into what you're thinking about individuals versus collectives, and what you mentioned just a few moments ago about scales of organizing.
And here, are you asking?
I apologize. Could you perhaps rephrase that?
In my question, I was kind of trying to get at how you see kind of the relationship between individuals and collectives in this.
So, and I mean, in terms of individuality, one of the problems for me is the ability for an individual to kind of navigate in and out of a kind of a collective oppressive logics. And so, put another way, I have a Black friend. or put differently, rather, especially with allyship, and this is in terms of the individual. I find allyship problematic because one of the assumptions is, for example, I'm thinking Rachel Dolezal as the complete, like, no, I'm going to adapt the Black identity in order to refuse whiteness, so to speak. And one of the things that I think might be more beneficial in terms of being allies is attacking, rather deconstructing whiteness, and that's kind of what I'm hoping to get at, if not here, then perhaps in the future, about what are these logics that we're talking about, and how can we look at, if we're talking about theological languages, a hereafter of this arrangement, this kind of arrangement that requires my object status and the subject status of whiteness. So for me, it's kind of maybe a prophetic kind of thing. I don't know if that answers your question, but at least on the individual end, is something I think about now. If anybody wants to talk about the collective, I don't want to take up.
I don't know if this is going to address your question, but I'll throw it out there. In thinking of the retrospective aspect of self-purification, I do think that there is a level of community that is involved, because people often aren't aware of the deficiencies that they have. I think this goes back to the ancients. Aristotle refers to the rash person as not being able to see courage for what it is, but instead seeing it as cowardice because their disposition is more bent on the extreme. And he says that the coward sees the courageous person as rash because the coward is bent on the extreme of deficiency. So pretty much we don't know what we don't know, and that's where I think community kind of comes in. So one of the things that I suggest is that when the individual is engaging in self-purification, they need to address their community of origin, the community that they currently identify with, and the community that they see as an adversary or as an opposition. I think in collecting all of those various perspectives, you get a complete picture. I do realize, though, that in terms of praxis and how to make that work, there are some difficulties, as communities will typically try to overpower other communities. That's a part of what we're talking about when we talk about the bill in DC. But I don't know if that addresses your whole individual and collective idea.
One of the communities, which gets back to the question, is family. You know, that it's at the site of the family, the Thanksgiving dinner table, where a lot of these conversations happen or start, at least, for good or for bad.
That's what I refer to as like the community of origins, where they come.
Before I get to Joe, I have a follow-up question related to self-purification. Since self-purification is one of the, he's like directly related to his nonviolent campaign, and my question is, I guess it's two parts. Do you believe that this self-purification is only applicable or possible in nonviolent campaigns? Because I'm thinking about other forms of self-actualization that could exist in other types of campaigns for liberation that are not nonviolent, or do you think it's a requisite, I guess?
Is there one in particular that you
Just one that is not nonviolent.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I thought about it in terms of other sorts of campaigns. King seems pretty bent on nonviolent direct action being the answer for not only Americans and Black, but the world. And I can't remember what letter he writes it in, but he pretty much says this is going to be the solution for the world. Because for anyone that's familiar with King's writing, he starts to expand beyond just civil rights in America, and he starts to actually write about issues in Vietnam and the Vietnam War and so on. I know that for him, a big part of self-purification is purifying yourself from bitterness and hatred. And I think that you can kind of read in his writing that he then assumes that that is going to take you to a place of nonviolence. I think for him, any kind of violent action or anything that is not bringing adversaries together is actually harming community, and it's taking you away from what he calls the beloved community or the ability to reconcile. So I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think it would be kind of difficult to take his entire framework and then try to put it in a framework that is nonviolent or that isn't bringing adversaries together.
Joe?
So hi everyone, once again, awesome presentation. I had a question for all three of you, and it was, where would you situate Black women in your research? And specifically with Ian and Joshua, I was wondering with double consciousness, I think that it doesn't speak exactly to what Black women experience in the country, and I would think it's more of like a triple consciousness in that sense, so you can complicate even more to like quadruple, to add like gender into the, like being cis or trans or being queer in any sense. And also Joshua, I was thinking about kind of to censor whiteness as kind of like the, I'm trying to use the language here, the Theodician construction of like the American identity wouldn't completely answer, like, I think whiteness as really, I would pin whiteness at the center, but I also think that there's more to it as well. And in terms of like how bodies are treated, Black women are like oppressed even further as their bodies are sexualized and sex used as violence for them in ways that Black men are not. Yeah. So I would wonder like how would you situate Black women in your scholarship?
Did you have?
Yeah. I didn't have a question, but just for all three of you.
Okay.
If I may, so, and again, this is coming from a place of not knowing what the heck is going on and starting out into the topic. I will say some of the best work I have seen to really talk about these problems come from Black women. So, there's that already in terms of thought. Who's doing the thinking? Who is providing us with the tools to deconstruct it? For me, for the most part, again, my bibliography is Black women. Now, and more to that point, I find it interesting. One of the things I find problematic with Coates' remembering of the body is that it usually only talks about the physical nature of that violence. So we know this for certain. Some people exploit that in ways to talk about it, but I also want to talk about the other ways that the violence takes place. And I think, so for example, my syllabi. For example, who is on my syllabus? Who is being used in ways to think about this? We had to get rid of James Combs' Crossing the Lynching Tree because it was too close to home in systematic theology courses. And so, in terms of finding more voices in the American Project to think about these things, I think intellectually is one way. And then also, one of the things Morrison notes in her recollection of the construction of early American literature is that it's not just a white lens, it's a white male lens. The maleness cannot be forfeited, and so that's the kind of beginning of a rubric, so to speak, white male. And again, we can talk more about sexual preference also and gender normativity, so to speak. So yeah, those are two ways I would start, but again, obviously there's much more.
So I actually am hoping to expand this and bring in what this means for women, specifically Black women. I also want to see what it means for minorities in general, religious minorities, ethnic minorities. I stuck with African Americans because that's who Du Bois was writing about, and for the sake of time. One thing that I didn't mention is in presenting the 5 contributors, the reason I think that they contribute to double consciousness is that they ingrain in our collective imagination an image of what it means to be American that lends social power to the practitioners and possessors of those norms, while often demeaning, marginalizing, and alienating minorities that don't necessarily practice those norms. With double consciousness, again, Du Bois is seeing like this tension between your Blackness and your Americanness. In talking about women, I'm curious, maybe you have an answer for this, what would be the two selves that you see trying to be reconciled as it relates to gender? And this is an open question for anybody. So in trying to incorporate the idea of women, I'd be interested in hearing where the tension is, because I definitely see the oppression, but I'm interested in seeing what two selves specifically are not being reconciled.
Well, I wouldn't, I think an issue there is thinking of it as duality. Like I think it's limiting to kind of just think of it as like a crossroad to two different places. But in that case, I would say like negate the Americanness and kind of work in the confines of being Black and a woman. I think citizenship is an issue that across the board for a lot of identities is something we negotiate with in terms of being American and what that means. But I think the tension and where the trauma lies is within like a Black, being Black and being a woman. Because I think a lot of, and more so with being Black, because I think a lot of the violence comes within, for Black women within the community, that kind of leaves a lot of like contemplation of like loyalty to the community or kind of like animosity or tension within it.
So, yeah, go.
I noticed in a lot of, particularly in Black liberatory scholarship written by men, there is a focus on, we're talking about the body, on like how the Black male body is racialized. So then they don't ever address how the Black woman's body is also, her gender is racialized, or her race is gendered. So when you're talking about liberation, not only are or black women as black having to deal with white supremacy, they're also dealing with patriarchal domination. So when it comes to this triple consciousness that you're talking about, I think about it in terms of once you address the issue of being rendered less, less embedded with power under white people, then you have to tackle the issue of finding equal footing with other members of the black community that are a different gender than you. So I feel like he was saying, I think it's less about this duality and overcoming this other self, and it's more about, I guess, deconstructing how race is gendered and gendered is race, because it's a whole other power dynamic that I feel a lot of black men in the liberatory work don't explore. And I don't think it's because they don't think it's important, but I think it's because that's a level of privilege that they're afforded given their maleness.
Right.
So.
If I may, just to continue the point, I will say one of the things within this vein, one of the things that I come across when I read a lot of times, especially a lot of folks that I would consider to be liberatory figures, so to speak, that I kind of try and shy away from in my writing, especially with Baldwin. I absolutely love Baldwin. But one of the things Baldwin talks about quite a bit is achieving one's manhood, or the kind of the barriers that stand in the way of achieving one's manhood. And again, you see manhood, and it's like, well, what? What's it's gendered, and I mean, one of the moves then would be to say, well, it's from a different time frame and such and such. Yeah. But now I'm thinking towards this. I'm not offering it as the solution, but one of the things I think it would look like would be to maybe examine the language, but to turn it on itself. Not necessarily to say, okay, so one of the things I see a lot of times in churches, God, people always say, oh, Father God will come to you, such and such, God, He's with you, and I'm like, I cringe. But one of the moves often rhetorically is to switch and say, God, she is with you. There's a shirt that walks around, God's a black woman. So, I don't know if that remedies it also, but I mean, at least what it does is makes aware that kind of what takes place in the rhetoric. It makes it plain. You name the demon, so to speak. Now, in writing, at least for us, and again, I'm be considered a black hetero man. So, what I tend to do is at least acknowledge it in writing. And I mean, I don't know if that looks like epigraph, so to speak. I don't know if it looks like taking a paragraph and saying I am trying to think around these kind of logics. So it's this kind of trying to function within an identity, but against the making universal my identity, so to speak. And again, I'm thinking towards this, and I don't know if that's the solution, so to speak, but I think that would remove me as or remove someone as oppressive of black women, so to speak. Women in general and other folks who are made at the margins at the construction of masculinity.
This is an awesome conversation, but we have to eat something in order to be strong enough for our three panels going forward. Let's thank this amazing panel.